Our plenary session today is on anticipatory action. And I would like to welcome to the stage its chair, Thalia Sparling, who is an assistant professor at LSHTM. Some of you will know Thalia from the work she has been doing on gap maps in agriculture, nutrition, health, which has helped to guide a lot of the research decisions we've been making in Amana. Thalia will introduce her team and we can proceed. So Thalia, over to you.
Wonderful. So we have Guya Roba, Boyd Hamela, Chesterman Kumwenda, and Lazarus Ganani. And I'm going to introduce them again after I give a few opening remarks.
So yes, I'm very glad to welcome you all to the first plenary of our last day. It's been so nice to see you all in person throughout this last week. I've certainly missed our gatherings. So I'd like to take a moment just to bring us all onto the same page about what anticipatory action actually is before we hear from our very distinguished speakers who have a tremendous amount of practical experience dealing with these mechanisms and will offer their perspectives. So early anticipatory action is also called early warning, early action, or forecast-based financing. But essentially, we're moving from reactive humanitarian aid models to anticipatory actions, and these are different from early warning systems because the actual actions are what we're really promoting and measuring. Anticipatory action is proven to be faster, more dignified, and more cost-effective than traditional humanitarian response, and this has been shown again and again through different evaluations of these actions. And it's not just more dignified in the response, it's far more participatory, grounded in and informed by local experience of risk, and it can be locally managed and co-produced and predefined based on consultative planning. So normally there are several components that make up anticipatory action. That is the use of data science and other data to understand and quantify risks, the development of collaborative and pre-planned contingencies, and pre-positioning when conditions on risk models are met. Usually humanitarian agencies make up the case for taking early action, but it's actually the long-term actors such as governments and service providers who have the responsibility for most of these actions. And although anticipatory action usually describes an assistance program with dedicated funding, other actions are also complementary in protecting livelihoods and health ahead of a crisis. These include providing information directly to people so that they can make their own informed decisions about their anticipatory actions, investing in preparedness, and also being able to be nimble and shift resources from planned interventions toward emergency response, often in the same sector. Now I'm going to briefly describe what data sources are for decision-making for anticipatory action. I'll start with technological advances, through which information relevant to early warning is more accurate and readily available than ever before. More and more data is available through anticipatory operational models for things such as heat, drought, floods, and other shocks. These models are usually parametric, which means that they're a family of statistical models that are based on probability distributions that have a finite number of parameters, and they're used for thresholding. So when thresholds are reached, these actions are triggered, and these are all predefined. Examples of this are remote sensing through satellite and terrestrial monitoring. And for instance, if you've ever heard of the TAMSAT alert system, we use this to predict the NDVI, or the Normalized Difference Vegetation Index, which is an indicator of drought. We use this to predict the availability of surface and subsurface water. We use the Global Copernicus Global Food Awareness System with other foresight technologies built into it to do daily probabilistic forecasts of flood inundation extents and depths, and the NOAA GFS model to calculate heat index values for heat waves. Then we come to our more traditional and familiar data sources of survey and surveillance data, which can be localized or they can be in aggregate, such as the IPC classifications. And lastly, but probably most importantly, we can use qualitative lived experience. And I hope that Guyo can speak more to this as we go on. So what is an anticipatory action plan? This is a collaborative, pre-planned contingency. And there are many networks that have emerged that function to coordinate anticipatory actions. And these coordinating bodies usually gain funding from government and non-government sources. And examples of these bodies and funders are the START network, which works on small and medium crises, the Central Emergency Response Fund of the UN, often via OCHA, and this is only in certain pilot countries, and FAO's Special Fund for Emergency and Rehabilitation Activities Anticipatory Action Window, as well as the Anticipation Hub. But more than these coordinating bodies, these networks bring together communities, dedicated funding, government agencies, and external response agencies, including INGOs, and agencies at the national level, such as the National Disaster Management Authority in Pakistan. The co-development of the contingency plan is critical to its success because this is done in advance. Communities and governments can drive the plan based on their needs and experience. Often local government agencies themselves trigger the anticipatory action, and then the agencies responsible for delivering goods, services, and other assistance follow the implementation plan that has been preset. So just to give you very concrete examples of what these actions look like, they include something called parametric insurance, where the insurance payouts are released once certain thresholds are met, and that can be purchased by nations as well as anticipatory agencies. For instance, African Union member states can purchase these types of insurance policies, and agencies that support anticipatory action can purchase replica insurance policies under the same conditions. And therefore, the payouts are made and they work together to implement these plans. They include, of course, unconditional and multi-purpose cash transfers and livelihoods protections. That could include parasite medications for livestock during floods, destocking prior to a disaster, or rerouting flood routes. It could also include market assessment and pre-positioning of supplies or stock, as well as food repositories and storage facilities or containers. For instance, they've given grain barrels to protect grain stores against floods in Pakistan. In terms of health, this could include actions such as stockpiling medicines and training of staff for adverse health events that are more likely to occur in certain types of crises or disasters. For instance, the risk of heat traps in low-income dwellings and coping strategies can be mitigated by interviewing the people in those dwellings and to find out about their coping strategies and build a response to that prior to a heat wave. It can also include increased training of community health workers and local staff, for instance, on safe delivery for pregnant women, should access to the larger health system be cut off. So I will close my remarks there, and I'm going to introduce again this wonderful panel who have really hands-on experience with dealing with this type of information and implementation plans in Malawi and beyond, especially in Africa. So I'd like to introduce, I'm going to start from the far end, Guyo Roba. He is the director of the Jamil Observatory for ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute. I have Boyd Hamela here with me, who is the chief economist for DODMA, the Department of Disaster Management Affairs in Malawi. We have Chesterman Kumwenda, who is the National Resilience and Emergency Coordinator for Food and Agriculture Organization in Malawi, and Lazarus Gonani, who is the Vulnerability Analysis and Mapping Officer for the World Food Program, again, here in Malawi. So we're going to go on to a structured discussion where I'm going to ask three main questions, and each panelist will have about 3 minutes to respond based on their perspective. So the first question is what anticipatory action means for you, and why it fits in your current context of work, even if in your work anticipatory action is called something different. So maybe I'll start with you. This time I will go in a line from my left to right. So I'll turn to you, Leslie.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair. I will try to be very brief because I know I only have 3 minutes. Anticipatory action is becoming a buzzword now. It's a new concept. So I'll try to be very simplistic in my definition. So the way, the word anticipatory, I think, is very easy to understand. So when we talk of anticipatory actions, within the disaster risk management framework, anticipatory actions are the actions that are deliberately taken ahead of a disaster. These are the actions that are implemented with an objective of trying to prevent or minimize the impact of an impending disaster. So for you to implement an anticipatory action, you first of all must have the evidence of the occurrence of a disaster. And this evidence could either be hard evidence, which is informed by, of course, scientific validation, and also could be soft evidence based on human sound judgment. This evidence must point to a high likelihood of the occurrence of an anticipated hazard or crisis or disaster. So any action that is undertaken with an anticipation of a disaster or a crisis ahead with the aim of trying to mitigate or minimize its impact, that one could be termed as an anticipatory action. Now, why is anticipatory action very relevant now? Within, of course, the context of my work and also maybe within the context of your work out there. We are all aware that the frequency of these disasters and crises, especially the natural disasters, has increased in recent times. For now, I think if you compare to 40 years ago, the occurrence of these disasters has increased by 5 times today compared to 40 years ago. I'm coming from FAO. Our role is to support the government, to work within the agriculture sector to improve its productivity. And you are all aware that agriculture in Malawi, being the backbone of the economy, being a livelihood that over 80% of the people depend on, has heavily been impacted by these disasters recently. We are just coming from the recent Cyclone Fred, which was a disaster, which was also, with the information that we had, was anticipated. But did we really implement something in line with the prevention of the mitigation of the tropical cyclone Fred that heavily affected us in this country? So briefly, I think anticipatory action is very relevant today because even from the studies that FAO has done from the projects that have been implemented globally, we've realized that if you spend $1 to implement actions ahead of a disaster, you are likely to save up to maybe $7 for the investment that you've done ahead of a disaster. So there are a number of studies that have been done. There are a number of evidence sources that we have now that acting before a disaster is very key, other than to wait for a disaster to happen and then you act later. Chair, let me stop there to give room for my colleagues also to come in.
Thank you so much. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I will not go into the definition as my colleague has indicated. I will just go straight to how the anticipatory action fits into what we do. As already introduced, I'm from the Department of Disaster Management Affairs. Our understanding of anticipatory action can be simply put to say it's a funded contingency plan. What we do when we develop a contingency plan, normally it's developed after we've received forecast for the upcoming rainy season. Most of the disasters that we have in Malawi are weather related or climate related. So when we've received the forecast for the rainy season, we do anticipate to say these are areas that will have drought. These are the areas that we might have floods. According to the Met's releases. So On anticipated action, what we do is we can sometimes preposition, that is knowing that in such an area, like in the recent flooding that we had of the tropical cyclone, we had to preposition in the Palombe, Mulanje, we had to preposition in Bangula. That is anticipating that we might not be able to reach to these people when they are hit by the disaster that we are anticipating. I would also want to mention that it's at different levels, as the chair made it in the introductions. We can anticipate, or we can do the pre-arrangements or prepositioning of the relief items, or even the insuring the crops, as most of the disasters do affect the agriculture sector. It at all levels, we can do the insurance at the crop insurance at the household level. It can be also a corporate cooperatives, but we have had also insurances, sovereign insurance. We have had recently the ARC arrangements that were anticipated actions, because we had anticipated that we'll have some droughts in the lower Shire and some lesser droughts in the central region and the northern region. We had anticipated that, and we had to engage ARC to have an insurance, sort of, that is to put it simply. We have also had with the World Bank, the CATDDO. It was an anticipated action, because we knew that much as we can have rains, there are certain areas that we do have droughts, and we do prearrange that these should ensure their crops, that if they don't harvest, and if the triggers are met or the threshold is reached, they should be compensated, or they should be assisted. So in practice, or in our working activities, this is how I can say. And it's not stated as the anticipated action in what we do. It's in our case, it's a funded contingency plan, because it's after we have developed the contingency plan for the country and the districts. It's when we do anticipate certain hazards and disasters, and we do move in to have some cushion that we should not feel the severity of the disasters that we've had. I cannot emphasize on the trends that we have had of disasters, the severity and frequency, as my colleague has already indicated. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you so much. Please continue, Lazarus.
Okay, thank you so much, Chair. And like my counterpart, the government counterpart here who has just spoken, I will define anticipatory action in the context of World Food Program, an organization which I'm representing. And as you might be aware, World Food Program is the largest humanitarian organization, and we focus on lives, saving lives and changing lives, and we provide actually relief in the context of emergencies. So we'll say we have been using actually the food assistance to build pathways of peace, stability, and prosperity for people recovering from conflicts, disasters, and the impacts of climate change. So this entails that all along, actually, we have been actually waiting for the disaster to occur and assist with the food assistance the people that are affected. So you will see that in the context of, say, if I can take example of the floods, which have a sudden onset, and when they occur, actually they tend to cut off some of the areas and they become impassable. It means if we wait for the floods to occur, then in the end we are also stuck to reach out to hard to reach areas, and the assistance might not get there. So, but with now anticipatory action, which means becoming proactive rather than reactive, it means acting early before the disaster happens. It's giving us actually an opportunity, a chance to do the prepositioning of the food items, as Dodma has already highlighted, and reaching out to all those areas that have been mapped to be maybe cut off during when the disaster happens. For example, the last Friday, actually, we had over 50% of the areas that were affected were cut off. And we had to use other means because we could not reach them by road. We had to use the boats as well as helicopters, which had to come to deliver food items. And these means of delivery are very, very, very expensive to run the choppers to drop food, and they carry also very little amount. But now with the anticipatory action, actually will assist us to minimize the cost of operation in this, because what we'll do is really repositioning the food items to the areas that we anticipate to be cut off. And in the end, when the disaster occurs, and those areas actually, they already have food commodities in their vicinity which they can use. And also the strength of anticipatory action is working in partnership with the government and other institutions. For example, if the government comes in also with other anticipatory action based on the projections forecast which have been made available, they can evacuate, already move people, including their maybe livestock and the other essential assets which they have at home to higher grounds, so that when the floods occur, they are not affected. So in that case, actually, you also even minimize the impact of the shock. So even from our side, with that partnership, it means we'll have to use less resources to reach out to the few people who might be affected in this, even maybe they might not be even affected. So it's the minimizing of the operation costs, which is very key in this case. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I turn to you, Guya, now. Happy to hear your thoughts.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Guya Roba. I work as a researcher at the International Livestock Research Institute, essentially leading a project, research to action project, that look at the food security and drought situation in the Horn of Africa. I'm not also going into the definition of anticipatory action. It's been done quite well by colleagues. But I think just to help you understand in our context of drought, a drought has a very discernible pattern. It starts from normal, it goes to an alert, it goes to alarm, it goes to an emergency, and then it goes to recovery. And each cycle, I think, has roughly 3 months in between. Almost all the countries in the Horn of Africa only call for support, declaring droughts as an emergency at emergency phase. And it's very constantly, as I think as colleague from FAO said, is that whatever you do in between, sort of smart investment, effective and proactive investment that you do in the first two parts of the cycle of drought is what counts as anticipatory action, because you're almost getting into that point. And what this means is that for you to do an anticipatory action, there are essential ingredients that cut across different disasters, whether you're dealing with flood, drought, locust invasion, this kind of thing. That you need to have, I think the crisis timeliness is very important. The early warning system, I think, which has improved over the years, the timeliness and also the accuracy has been improving, but we're not making use of that particular gain that we make from early warning. And then the third part is that you need to have an anticipatory action, a sort of, what do you call it? It has a name. An anticipatory action sort of roadmap that we need to protocols that we need to develop. And then you need to have a flexible funding that helps you to respond. In a situation of drought, what you do at the alert stage is very important, because in 3 months, it doesn't make any sense to respond to the same mechanism at the point of alarm, because that's require different kind of sets of support to livestock keepers and pastoralists and etc. So an entire set of things that you do prior to disaster is what counts in our case as anticipatory action. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all of these perspectives. It's very interesting to hear how thoroughly all of you have understood and built in the ideas of anticipatory action, and how thoroughly you've engaged with what it can mean and what can happen if we build these protocols and these frameworks and have the data available and have implementation plans that are nimble enough to match what's going on the ground. So I think I'd like to ask you if you'd be so willing to open up to us about how anticipatory action has been embraced in your institutions, in your region, in your country, and maybe share with us a bit of how it's worked well, how you've sort of seen that it has mitigated crises very operationally, and then maybe if you have any examples also of where what the barriers are to uptake, or what could have been done better if we were to institutionalize these processes more. What might it take to do that? So maybe we will switch it up. Let's start with Boyd, and then we can go to Chesterman, Guyo, and Lazarus.
Thank you so much. In our case, I think anticipatory action has been embraced, and we have made the good progress or good strides in some of the interventions that we had thought to do. I'll cite an example of the recent tropical cyclone Fred response. As my colleague from WFP has indicated, the disaster that we had was too huge for Malawi, and it was one of its kind that it has no comparison. However, we did all we could, and I can say here that we did the best, because in the areas that we had anticipated flood, all the propositioning was done, and it really served well, because as he has indicated that most of the areas were cut off from using the let's say road transport, but we were able also to provide, like the Lower Shire, the Shire Highlands, we were able to provide relief items because we had the incorporated anticipatory, or we had prepositioned relief items to assist them. As I've indicated in my earlier sentiments, that most of our disasters are from weather-related things. We tried to liaise with other, as a department, we tried to liaise with other departments also that inform, or from where we get the data that we use, or information that we use when we are doing our things, like the MET, the Agriculture Ministry, or the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development, who developed the MVAC report, that we should be getting those reports well in advance, like by June, we should be able to have the report and understand who will be in need of food in the months to come, so that instead of having to wait and be able to provide them with relief items, we should be able to give them, we can give them inputs so that they can use residual moisture to grow their own food, instead of giving them food when the situation is acute. These are some of the issues that we had. We have already started dealing with them, that we should be getting this report well in good time, so that we can move to some resilience activities going forward. Other than that, I have also mentioned of insurance. A big chunk is being undertaken by our civil society organizations, but we have also, as government, been able to act in an anticipatory way by engaging the institutions that have indicated the Africa risk capacity on some insurance. So to indicate how we have embraced it, or how we could have done better, the only shortfall that I can communicate, I can share with you here, with our experience with Tropical Cyclone Fred, is that the anticipation was not complete. We anticipated floods, we anticipated whatever we anticipated, but we did not anticipate that a big number of the lives that we'll lose will come from mudslide. So we had focused on, I can say, the traditional, we are always hit by floods, droughts here and there, but we never thought that we will lose more lives from mudslide. So it's that element that we did not capture in our anticipation, so that we could say, oh, those that we lost from the Chirobwe or the other areas could have been told to move. But the use of information like early warnings and the like, I think we did the good job, because even warning people, the warning of people started prior to the catastrophe. So that's where I can say our anticipation or our anticipatory action was not complete, in the sense that we left out the geological element of the disaster that we experienced. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's very, very interesting to hear.
Yeah, thank you so much, Madam Chair. So for FAO, I would start to mention our participation in anticipatory actions at global level. For FAO, we started participating in the discussions around anticipatory action way back in 2014 at global level. We tried as much as possible to mobilize resources that would be earmarked for, any anticipated disasters in all the countries where we are operating. Just as an example, from the year 2016 to somewhere around 2021, we had mobilized around 260 million US dollars that was deployed towards the, early warning and early action activities. So we've tried as much as possible to institutionalize the concept of anticipatory action, to the extent that at the moment, at the global level, we have an anticipatory action team in our headquarters in Rome, which is supporting, various countries to, develop frameworks and protocols for implementing anticipatory actions in their respective, context. Even coming down to the sub-region here in Southern Africa, we also have an anticipatory action hub, which is resident in our regional emergency office in South Africa. We have colleagues there who are also supporting us within, this part of Africa. At country level in Malawi here, we started participating, in anticipatory action, initiatives in 2021. We were involved both at the UN level as well as even at the agency level in FAO. We participated in the development of the OCHA anticipatory action for dry spells, which was a multi-sectoral, sort of framework that would guide the country, to implement anticipatory action initiatives. So the OCHA framework had the, four thematic areas or sectors that it was targeting. We had the component of protection, and then there also was the component of water, sanitation and health. We also had the nutrition component, and as FAO and WFP, we were contributing to the agriculture and livelihoods sector. So we developed this framework for dry spells. We piloted it in 2021-2022 season. Unfortunately, the triggers were not met. The season was okay, so it wasn't activated. Actually, in parallel to that, we also developed a sector-specific anticipatory action protocol for FAO Malawi. We also developed this framework for dry spells in collaboration with, the Ministry of Agriculture and other partners under the leadership of DODMA. We have the framework up and running. Unfortunately, also in the first year, during the season 2021 to 2022, it did not trigger because this was framework for dry spells. And as you are aware, during the, we also piloted it during the 2022-2023 season. Unfortunately, instead of having dry spells, we had this massive flooding due to tropical cyclone Fred. So this brought us back to the drawing board to start also thinking of developing a protocol or framework for floods. The only challenge that we have, I think a lot has to be done around the protocol for floods, because flood is a rapid onset disaster, meaning that if you are to have a framework to implement anticipatory action activities, the window or the read time between the initial alert and then the occurrence of the flooding itself is very, most of the time is very narrow to implement agricultural interventions, because our protocol is based on agricultural interventions. Just to single out, of course, some of the interventions that we put into the framework under this framework for dry spells, the interventions that we are proposing, the simpler ones were the alert messages, early warning messages to our farmers to pre-position some inputs and also to prepare for dry spells. And these messages were alongside messages that would do, help farmers, to adopt the planting of early maturing, drought-tolerant, seeds, and also to prepare in situ soil and water conservation structures so as to harvest the little moisture that they would get from the, the little rains that they would experience. So this framework is still up and running. Actually, we have just developed a project. We have actually earmarked around $500,000 US to prepare for the upcoming El Nino. As some of you may be aware, there is a projected El Nino for the 2023-2024 season. So El Nino for Malawi, especially for the southern parts and the larger part of the central region, we normally anticipate dry spells. So we are, of course, looking forward to responding, assuming this El Nino, materializes, and then we have already earmarked some resources to mitigate, the severe impact of El Nino, especially with regard to dry spells. So for us, I would say we've tried as much as possible to institutionalize, and we have frameworks in place that could ensure, help us to ensure that we mitigate on time when the triggers for dry spells are met.
Thank you so much, Chesterman. Well, I hope that we do get to practice, but probably it's better if these don't get triggered quite yet, in terms of extreme events. But certainly when you're preparing for one, probably the opposite will happen given the nature of climate change now. Great, thank you so much for those really interesting comments. Lazarus, would you like to speak?
Okay, thank you. For World Food Program, actually we also have our overall plan globally for integrating anticipatory action into our programs. So far, I can say that we have anticipatory action integrated in 28 countries across the globe. And these countries actually in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, we have a total of 28 countries, and covering almost 2 million people in those programs. And coming to the region here, the Southern African region, we have 6 countries which have already integrated the anticipatory action, and they have the plan, and they are executing the activities. Mainly, these have been in place for the past 1 to 2 years, and in some of the countries, actually, it has triggered, and the payments have come through, and the activities implemented. In other countries, like my colleague FAO said here, we have a UN which is coordinated by OCHA. We have FAO, WFP, UNICEF, and the other UN agencies there. It didn't trigger for Malawi because actually that was a drought one, but instead we received too much rains. That could be the primary reasons. But it's still in place. So we are happy about that. And we, as WFP, we have a clear roadmap in terms of how we go ahead and have anticipatory action systems in place in going to other countries. Like by 2025, actually, we are planning that we should have up to 40 countries having the anticipatory action plans in their programs. And beyond that, also more and more countries to come in. So we are getting even good support from our headquarters region officers to make sure that this overall plan is really implemented. And because it's really very important for us as WFP. One of the issues actually which I can point out is I think anticipatory planning for the drought has been simpler, even to develop the triggers. But I think one of the challenging elements have been the floods, especially floods actually take different dimensions. It can be heavy rains, but in this part of Africa, it's cyclones. So they might have different triggers to be modeled. But that is an area, I think as we go on with this, I will put across, because that is the area which we need a lot of support from either the academia, the researchers, and the other weather-related departments across to set up those triggers. So that's it, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lazarus. I'll turn to you, Guyo.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, I'll answer this question from the drought perspective. That's what we have in the Horn of Africa. So the anticipatory action conversation has gained traction in the last couple of years because of the protracted drought crisis we had in the Horn of Africa. So at the regional level, we have a body called, an entity called IGAD, Intergovernmental Authority on Development, which is an 8-member state largely affected by drought. So the conversation started at the regional level slightly to develop a regional roadmap for anticipatory action. It has a number of pillars. This regional roadmap has a number of pillars. I'm not very sure whether it's fully out, but it's validated like 2 months ago. I was there in Addis Ababa. So, and one of the key bill I remember is, one is on the harmonization of the triggers and threshold. And then there is a, I think, multi-actor, multi-sector coordination framework to be developed, aligning and coordinating financing. And of course, the last one, I think, is something to do around evidence-based advocacy and awareness raising. So this is a broader regional roadmap that countries have to domesticate. The 8 countries have to domesticate these as one of the overarching guiding principle of how they respond in that. But I think if you get example of few countries like in Kenya now, we've taken a step forward through legislation of the National Assembly. We have established a National Drought Emergency Fund, which is basically a flexible funding that will help you unleash financing across the cycles of drought, provided the prediction or the forecast is 70%, at least above 70% accurate. And that I think is one of the key things, because we have having this sort of contingency planning, but I think because of the false alarm and number of things, we haven't managed to position the financing, and financing is still a big issue right now. So coming to ILRI, at the Jamil Observatory, we're running a project which is so much centered on anticipatory action, which is basically food security early action in dryland, pastoral areas in Kenya and Somalia for now, but with interest in the Horn of Africa. What we're doing actually is that there's serious challenge in terms of building evidence around anticipatory action. What does the economics of focus-based financing look like? What does linking triggers to indicators, threshold, and all these things looking like? So because of that, through our community of practice, we have set up a number of research projects, some at postdoc level, quite a number of PhD students at the University of Edinburgh in UK, which is the lead of the project, running this project. We have around 6 PhD students and 2 postdoc, and still we are counting more projects. And the reason why we are doing that is we have to build strong evidence for countries and for regions to start taking this change of action, because anticipatory action is basically, changing behavior from reactive to proactive. And to do that, you need to have a very strong body of evidence. And that's what we are doing as a research, and a contribution largely is to the pillar of evidence-based advocacy, awareness raising, and etc. So we currently encourage any ideas that you think is interesting for research package of that nature. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm really struck by the degree of planning, how many of these concepts have really been embraced, how the approaches are almost always multi-sectoral. Chesterman, you really mentioned the integration of these different sectors and the extent of financing that has been put forth. Of course, hearing that there is a big need for increased financing and how cost effective that will be given the challenges of climate change ahead. So thank you very, very much for sharing your experiences. I also was taken by the points that even though we practice and build these plans, it is very challenging to be able to predict. Sometimes thresholds are not met. I've seen some examples where they were met, but they didn't actually result. For instance, heat and early warnings were met in Asia, but the actual heat wave did not continue and the funds were released. And that funding was actually used for preparedness, to actually do those actions to prepare households for the future shocks, which certainly must be a good investment, even if the acute heat wave doesn't materialize. So it sounds like we are still, as a community, working to become more and more flexible, more and more informed, and to improve predictions in our models, which leads me into our last question before we have some time for audience questions, which are, of course, predictably as the next steps, what you think really needs to happen, what the levers of change will be to advance our knowledge, whether it's through research or institutional policy, the complexity around this and the capacity. And just to make sure that we save enough time for questions, I'll just ask to keep 2-3 minutes maybe, so that we definitely don't want to run over. And also we always need to save time for poster viewing so you can get in your votes. So I'll start with you, Guyo, first, and we'll move maybe backwards towards me.
Okay, thank you very much. I think in terms of the next step, what is critical from where we sit, there are two things which are critical. One, I think all countries are not homogeneously at the same level in this anticipatory action conversation. So because of that, I think the starting point is to take stock of the status of anticipatory action in different countries at the regional level. What this means is that it's to look at the early warning systems, what is the system for focus-based financing, what is the system for financing. There are many things you can actually definitely, unpack to understand. What is the institutional capacity? What is the system for delivering anticipatory action? How do you link the projectized AA-driven processes to our national processes? What are the blockers and opportunities for AA? So there's so many areas for further investigation, and given that this is not something very new, but we're trying to align a systematized way of looking at disaster from this anticipatory action. So the first part in terms of the way forward is this issue around how do you build evidence, strengthen evidence for pushing this agenda from reactive to proactive? Because there's moral sense, there's economic sense, there are all kinds of senses in that. The second part of this is for countries, I think we need to have an harmonized framework because we have multi-sector, multi-actors, multiple level of things happening. There are national level, sub-national level, local level. So there are all these level questions that is happening in our context in Kenya, and of course in the region. So how do we push an harmonized framework around this issue? And I think lastly, what is important is how do we gain from the evolution in technologies, artificial intelligence, the big data for countries like Somalia where data is a bit scarce. There are many other gains in there. So if you want to have that, I think it's two things. One is to build that body of evidence to do that, and then to build an opportunity for dialogue around this issue. And when you dialogue, then you push a policy change. And I gave an example of Kenya already, which has a specialized delivery fund, which is flexible. You don't need to go through bureaucratic, treasury, and etc. to respond. And I think it has worked from previous experience on how we did our disease response fund, which is centralized, state, centered in the Directorate of Veterinary Services, and it's quite quick to unleash because you are responding to a crisis. So I think those are a few things that came to my mind when you think of the future and the next step. But then also, of course, there are quite good areas of study that is still evolving. The economics of focus-based financing is still very much debatable. So there are many investments required to position that because government cannot allocate funds because of they always blame on the false early warning systems and all these things. But early warning has been fairly accurate, much available, timely, and all the rest. So I think we can use that momentum to push that conversation on a dialogue and a policy and institutional shift around this issue. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That's very interesting. And to you, Lazarus.
Yeah, okay, thank you. For me, actually, I'm looking at the anticipatory action will be actually successful if we set the triggers correctly in terms of the triggers which will now trigger the actions on the ground. So in that, it is dependent on how the forecast is done. Are we doing it well, or how can we do it well? So this is an area which needs to be done precisely, to be looked at by those weather forecasters, whoever could be, but I understand some of them are here. The researchers, there is quite a lot of information, historical data, and even the current data which is there, which can assist us. So I'm looking at strengthening on the forecasting side and strengthening on the setting of the triggers, because it has to trigger for it to work. So not loose triggers per se, not really setting triggers which can trigger every year, then it's not a good program, but appropriate triggers, which means there's need to think around what can we set as triggers. We know that the one trigger might not be uniform to across all, to all countries. So we need to look at also area-specific triggers. There might be others which are uniform, but others might not be uniform. But even within the same hazard, the same shock, it could be say floods, as I said. It could be riverine floods, the rivers overflowing. It might not rain in a certain area, but the river passes their area, then it floods and affects people, although they haven't received rain. Or it might rain even in other countries, then affect another country which is on the lower side where the river is flowing. We need to look at all those, and so we look at the river line. It could be issue of cyclone. If it's a cyclone, where do we put a line, okay, to say that it can trigger when a cyclone is forecasted at this level and in this path? So those are the areas which we really require. I think the countries will really struggle when it reaches to say we are developing our anticipatory plan. When it comes for flooding, it's very even difficult to set those. Even the drought, as we heard, there are some triggers which use water requirement satisfaction index, which is satellite, using the high resolution satellite imagery, okay, fine. But others may just use maybe area yield index. And so all these have differences. And the different anticipatory actions which are in one area, because an area can have maybe 2 or 3 different organizations having even two different approaches for their anticipatory action. You find that it triggers in one and it doesn't trigger for the other. It's an issue of how these triggers are set. So, and an issue of harmonizing all these is also very important. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lazarus. And to you, Boyd.
Thank you, Chair. I think much has been indicated by my colleague here that I think we need not to approach anticipatory action as another totally new thing that we are having. let's just leverage on the existing efforts that we have had. I'm saying this to bring to your understanding of our context as a country. With what has been happening, with the experience that we've had over the years, it shows that our proximity to the Indian Ocean and the other underlying factors like the rapid deforestation and the like, we are very susceptible to almost all the hazards. That is, if we are to have floods, they will have they will come with even more than what we can anticipate. If we are to have drought, it will be a heavy drought that is beyond maybe our comprehension. So the key issue in having anticipatory action work, I think it's let's make use the available data or generate additional data that will inform us on all these hazards and the anticipated disasters. I will cite an example with the many bare hills that we have. We can comfortably say occurrence of mudslide will not be surprising, will not be a shock. So with such anticipation, what if we confirm with substantiated data, with evidence that with the way we are, with what our environment is looking like, these are inevitable, and we should be able to anticipate the worst than what we have experienced in any of the disasters, be it floods or be it drought, be it what, even the mudslides that I've talked about. And that firms up the need for a multi-hazard risk assessment. As a nation, as a country, I think it's imperative that we have adequate data coming from evidence-based data that is coming from a proper risk assessment to understand what risks or what hazards are where. And that will be making it very easy for efforts in anticipating whatever is to happen. I think that's what I can say, other than what colleagues have indicated on the issues of drought and the issues of research. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Boyd. And to you, Chesterman.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and many thanks to my colleagues who have spoken quite well on, on the next steps that we need to engage into as we try to advance the anticipatory action agenda. So, Madam Chair, maybe, let me just try to echo some of the, issues that they have already highlighted. But let me say that we need a paradigm shift in our thinking as well, because when we are talking of anticipatory action, this should not just be left to our, our government or development partners. It should also, I think, apply even to us as individuals. Because by the end of the day, we are the ones that are going to be affected by, all the disasters that affect us. So for us to do better, I know there are a lot of efforts that have already been done. I also wanted to mention that at national level, in terms of institutionalizing or anticipatory action, we just had a national dialogue platform in 2022, where we developed a national roadmap for implementing, anticipatory action initiatives in the country. And this was under the leadership of Dodma. It was actually launched by, the director, the commissioner for disaster himself. So we have a national roadmap with 4 thematic areas, which is a guide for us to implement, national initiatives on anticipatory action. However, amongst the thematic areas, the issue of evidence-based advocacy is key. We need to, to bring up evidence that acting ahead of disasters saves a lot. As I mentioned, within FO, we've done, some analysis, some studies in our projects, whereby if you invest $1 in anticipatory initiatives, you are bound to save up to $7 if you wait for a disaster to happen and then you respond. So we need to bring up evidence on all the, the interventions that we've done to advocate for more financing, because I'm pretty aware that as much as donors have now also embraced the, forecast-based financing, but we still have a large gap in terms of finance. Not many donors would put their resources when they're not too sure of whether a disaster is going to strike. So we need now to invest more in terms of generating evidence, as my colleagues have already said. We need, a lot of investments in error warning systems. We need a lot of investment in information management, and then to, organize this evidence in a portal, of course, through Dodema, so that it could be accessible to bring, the alertness that is, required for donors to put their monies on, and for actors also to move, to embrace, the anticipatory action initiatives. So, Madam Chair, I think what we need to do now that we have a roadmap, all we need is just to make sure that that roadmap is operationalized, is brought to the attention of all the actors, and to ensure that, we start now, walking the talk. Let's not just bring up these frameworks that we already have, but let's ensure that these frameworks are operational. My colleague from WFP touched on, harmonization of, trigger systems. Yes, I think we need to do that. We need to create what is called a community of practice in the country, whereby all actors would come together to share, to take stock of what is happening in terms of anticipatory action, and to ensure that we align ourselves in the right, sort of path, and we harmonize our approaches and our trigger systems, and then advocate for more funding to ensure that these are implemented. Madam Chair, I know I don't have time. Let me stop there.
Thank you so much. This has been very informative. I think what's quite interesting is that actually there's been so much both political and financial will. Obviously, what I'm hearing is that there needs to be more, including working across levels, working across sectors, working between to be nimble, and I will be staying tuned for the results of all of that research coming out of the observatory. I think I will just offer a few closing remarks, which is that I think the tenets behind anticipatory action are actually not particularly new, and but in the growing climate crisis, as well as the Chesterman mentioned the unprecedented number and size of appeals based on climate-related and humanitarian shocks due also to conflict and political displacement. This has certainly gained traction and been formalized. And one of the things that I would mention is that a lot of this anticipatory action started to take shape following the 2010 Haiti earthquake and the Pakistan floods, with the transformative agenda through many different actors. And there have been lots and lots of different accountability movements, some arguably more successful than others. But one of the key components of these accountability movements is the question of accountability to whom. And if you don't mind me being candid, our rather slow speed towards more collaborative, inclusive, and dignified humanitarian aid mechanisms is unfortunate. But it does seem that there's quite a lot to hope for in terms of what the systems that we are starting to implement and learn from, and speaking to each other across sectors, across levels. And we've heard that from all of our panelists today. And certainly the certainty surrounding the uncertainty that we face in our precious time here on Earth We hope that anticipatory action will grow and become more and more robust and as a way to deliver more ethical humanitarian aid as we go forward. So I'm very thankful to all of our speakers. Why don't we give them a warm round of applause?